Hey everyone, and welcome to another sew along. In this video I am sewing a cardigan, a more structured version of a cardigan. It's more like a jacket, and I'm using my own pattern, the Eivy cardigan, which I'm wearing right now, but I'm going to make a little bit of a twist now. If you are familiar with a French brand called Busnel, I think I pronounced that right, it has a very iconic like cardigan jacket. It's almost like a blazer. It's double-breasted and has lapels, and the really cute things about those cardigans as well is that they have some really nice nautical brass buttons with an anchor and a rope, and I just really like that style. And the Eivy cardigan, the version I'm wearing right now, is quite similar in some ways, so I'm going to adapt a few of the details that I really love about the Busnel cardigan, but I'm going to use my own Eivy pattern instead. So what we're going to learn in this video is a lot of tips on how to sew structured garments when using stretchy knits, because that can definitely be a bit of a challenge, because as we know, knits have a tendency to grow, to expand, so it can be hard to make something a bit more tailored but still using knit fabric. And I have lots and lots of tips about that, which I will share in this video. So let's start with the sewing. Now, before we start sewing, there are some key things that I like to address when you're sewing structured garments such as a cardigan or a blazer using stretchy knit fabrics. And a key concept here is to stabilize things, because as we know, knit fabrics can grow. If you watch the video I did recently when I sewed the girly knit top, you could see this in action. But this growth here is something we are definitely keen to prevent when sewing this cardigan. So I'm going to share some of my top tips to prevent the knit fabrics from growing and to give it a more structured and nice, almost like a tailored finish. Fusible knit interfacing or stretch interfacing. So this is basically, as the name says, interfacing with some stretch. Now there are lots of different versions of this. Some has a lot of stretch, some has four-way stretch, some have only stretch in one direction. And by the way, I've actually done a video about stretch fusible interfacing, so I highly recommend you check that out if you want to dive deeper into that topic. But I will give you a few suggestions now, sharing on where I'm using this stretch fusible on the Eivy cardigan. One key spot to stabilize is of course the facing or the placket of the cardigan, because if the placket isn't stabilized, it won't look as neat as and nice and sharp in the crisp fold, if that makes sense. And secondly, since I'm adding real working buttonholes on this very stretchy rib knit, double knit fabric like this, can you see how stretchy it is? Trying to sew buttonholes on that fabric without using some type of stabilizing function is not something I would recommend. And secondly, you might ask, well, on what side should I add the interfacing? Should I add it on the outside of the garment or on the inside? So for instance, should I add it on the facing or at the front piece? And my general suggestion is that you add it on the back piece. So for instance here, I have added the fusible interfacing on the facing part. The one is going to be inside towards my body. But there are some exceptions to that. For instance, on the collar, because as I just shown you, this fabric is so stretchy. I've actually interfaced both the upper and the under or the lower collar. Doing both sides definitely helps a lot. That's something my conclusion after sewing with knit garments for so many years. Another place where I'm going to use fusible interfacing. Let me see if I can pick this piece up here. I have so many pieces. Do you have this problem sometimes that the pieces seems to get lost? Even if you have a small sewing space, sometimes they have a tendency of disappearing, and I think that's what happened right now. Let me see here if I can find the pocket, because what I was wait a minute, it's on my cutting table. I have also added fusible interfacing on the inside of the pocket. So again, because that will add some stability, and I will also of course top stitch the pocket opening. So that's why I highly recommend, because otherwise if you are attaching a patch pocket or a knit pocket, usually when you top stitch, especially if you're using a regular sewing machine, the fabric has a tendency of growing, and sometimes you can see those bumps and it's wobbly, and you don't want that look on a dressy garment. So that's why again I highly recommend that you use some fusible stabilizer. Another thing I always do before I start sewing is that I stay stitch openings. So in this case I am stay stitching the neckline, and stay stitching means that you stitch a straight, or in this case I'm using a narrow zigzag because it's knit, just to keep the neckline in shape, because otherwise if you start adding the collar, which is interfaced as well, there's a risk that the neckline is suddenly much larger than the collar is, and of course because you're using knits, which is not a great idea. So that's why I personally find it so important to stay stitch. And I have a little bit of a trick again to share with you, and that is if your neckline has been growing out of control and you're like, dang, what you can do that is finger press it back into shape. So instead of just stay stitching, you can put your index finger behind the presser foot and press a little piece of fabric fold behind the presser foot, and then you start sewing, and then you let that fold build up a little bit, and then you release it, and then you start building up another piece of fold and release it. Do this not too extreme because otherwise the fabric might bunch up, but doing just a little bit of that can pull the fabric back into place. And this is something you can do also if you're sewing bias fabric using silk or rayon, because you will experience similar things happening, that the neckline is like, oh, what happened? Well, sometimes some fabrics has a tendency of growing just you looking at it, right? So that's why stay stitching is such an important skill to utilize. Good old steam to shrink it back. So to just use your regular iron, and then you don't touch the fabric, but you go crazy on the ironing button, or the iron push button, or the one that generates a ton of steam, and then you just hover that iron on top of your fabric, and you just push as much steam as you can possibly manage, and that will actually help shrinking back the fabric a bit. You can use that for a lot of instances, especially if you're dealing with knit fabrics that has unfortunately grown. So I have top stitched it down here, and then I've basted it on the sides here, because then it's going to add two different pieces and it's going to be enclosed. And of course also here you see the pocket. So that's a really nice way of adding pockets. So if you're having a garment that has like a princess seam, you can actually utilize that to add pockets. It's a nice way of saving time. And of course, if you are using knit fabrics, sometimes sewing patch pocket can be a little bit tricky, but you know what? I have a trick for you as well. I actually use this for the pockets on the Eivy cardigan. Can you see? Here I have drawn a pencil line with a pencil that has the same width as the fabric that I'm folding up on the bottom, that I'm going to top stitch as the bottom of the pocket. So you just fold over that along that line, and then you press with your iron, and that is like magic. So you get like a super crisp pressed fold. And if you're doing a patch pocket on knit fabric, so what you do is that you just cut the finished pocket shape without the seam allowance. It could be round, it could be square, it could be, have different shapes. And then you just press around that. So you just press in the seam allowance around that pocket shape. And that's amazing. I think it's because this is paper, a regular little bit stiffer paper, it has starch. So I actually think that's why it gets so stabilized. So it's almost like having, spray starch, but you get some starch from the paper. I guess that's a trick. I love it anyways. I just wanted to say a few things before I start sewing the shoulder seams, and then I'm going to move on to the color. And that is that I'm using several different machines today. You can use just a regular sewing machine to sew the Eivy cardigan actually, because this is a pattern that is designed for more substantial, thicker knits that usually have much more stability. So you can actually sew your Eivy cardigan just using a regular sewing machine and a narrow zigzag stitch. So not a straight stitch and not a very pronounced zigzag stitch, just a narrow zigzag stitch, meaning that you decrease the width of the stitch so it almost looks like a straight stitch, but it still retains some of that nice stretch. And if you want to hem your cardigan on a regular sewing machine, I highly recommend that you use the machine blind hem stitch, and I have already done a video on this technique where I also show how you can use that on knit fabrics. So I have also sewn the collar here, and I will actually top stitch one because I was actually in the shops today checking out an original Bushnell jacket, and they are actually top stitching the collar about 1 centimeter in, so I'm going to do that. Now I'm going to attach the collar, and before that I will top stitch it. Fingers crossed everything will work out fine. I honestly think that the collar looks pretty good. Let's see if we can switch this around. You can see here in the back. This is the collar, so it's a flat collar. And as you can see, there are still no sleeves, which is what we're going to do now. And if you're familiar with sewing knit tops, you know that you usually start by attaching the sleeve along the sleeve opening, and then you sew together both the side seam and the sleeve seam, the one underneath, as one continuous seam. So it's very straightforward. So I'm going to do that right now. All right, you can see, yes, it's black on black, and it's also black outside because the time is almost, I think, almost 9 p.m. now. I've been sewing for several hours now, so it's pitch dark outside. So maybe you can't even see how the Eivy cardigan is actually looking right now. But don't worry, at the end of the video, I will definitely film the finished cardigan in a better light with all the details and stuff, so you can really see how it looks. So what I'm going to do now is that I definitely need to hem it, and I'm going to use my Coverstitch machine to hem both the sleeves and of course the bodies. And if you're curious about how I cover stitch, I do recommend that you check out a video I just made recently on how to hem using your Coverstitch machine. This is a step-by-step tutorial where you can see everything that all the tricks and tips that I use when I'm cover stitching. And before I forget it, I've also just released a cover stitch sewing course. So if you're curious about the cover stitch course, you will of course find information about that in the description section of this video as well. You know what? I'm actually almost done. The problem is that the most exciting thing is left, which is sewing machine buttonholes on the cardigan. I'm going to use my trusty old Banina, and it's going to take some trials and errors probably until I feel secure enough to actually start sewing buttonholes onto the actual garment. As I talked about, I'm using these buttons. They are so nice, so I just want to make sure I want to have proper everything. And I'm also using buttonhole silk, which I thought would be a nice touch because I'm using such a nice, a bit more expensive wool fabric. I thought it would be really nice to make the buttonholes look really good as well. So hopefully this buttonhole silk will look really nice. I will just use it in the needles. I don't think I will use it in the bobbin. I don't think that's necessary. But I think the silk is going to be a nice addition. So now I'm basically just going to do lots of samples and we'll see how things go, and well, stay tuned. So I stayed up really late last night. I sewed all the buttonholes and then the buttons, and I felt it went pretty well. I mean, the buttonholes are a bit difficult when sewing on it, but I think they turned out pretty well. And then when I was going to add the buttons, I realized that I've made a faux pas, which I guess is suitable because I'm making a French-inspired cardigan jacket. Can you tell that something is a little bit different than normal, so to speak. It's not a big deal, but it kind of bums me out because it wasn't a conscious decision. Yeah, so basically, if you haven't noticed already, the buttoning is mirrored because when you traditionally, there's an old tradition of female-oriented garments, that they have the buttoning and overlapping in this direction, and on male they have it on this direction. So I accidentally mirrored it the way I had intended it to. Now, it's not a big deal, it has happened to me before, but the only thing, as I said, it bums me out a little bit because it wasn't a conscious decision. And for context, is that I have strong difficulties in telling left from right. So it's actually, if you've seen some of my older videos, you can actually see this happen in action, that I go completely blank and I have no idea what left and what right is. So it just can't go blank in my head, which I think definitely contributed to this fact, and the fact that I was staying up so late sewing, which again is always a risk factor when it comes to mistakes. So I will just do a few more tweaks now. I will attach the facing to the shoulder so it doesn't flip, and then I'm going to cover the seam allowance in the back with a beautiful band, and then I'm done. So in just a few minutes I will be able to show you the finished cardigan. I'm really liking it. So just a few more tweaks and then I'm finally done. All right, are you curious on how it turned out? Well, let's see if there's a J or a no. Anyways, this is how it looks when I button it up. We can look from the sides. As you can see, there's a nice shaping here, and that's because the Eivy cardigan has princess seams both in the front and in the back. And of course the pockets, very important. And the buttoning we have already dressed. It wasn't perhaps as intended, but I will say still that I am really happy with how it turned out. I will never ever think about the fact that the buttoning is the wrong anymore. I think I've already gotten over it, even though it was a bummer. So we'll look in the back as well. I hope it looks good. So yeah, a really nice project to make, and I really hope that this video has given you some ideas and confidence and inspiration to tackle more structured knit garments as well, because it's definitely a different type of process. But if you use some of the tricks that I shared within this video, you can definitely make lots of progress and really take, your knit to that level that you really would like it to. As you say, there's no magic. It's just, lots of prep work and not making too many mistakes, which happens, as we know. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. Stay safe, and I talk to you soon. Bye bye.